Hi, Christina. It's great to connect with you today. I was really excited to speak with you, especially since your former NYU law admissions. I'm sure everyone wants to know what it was like working there. But first, just tell us a little bit about how you got into it, what your experience was like there.
Hey, wonderful. Very nice to talk to you, Steve. I was at NYU Law a few years ago from 2015 to 2017 as Assistant Director of JD Admissions. And prior to that, I did read files for Harvard Law School JD Admissions program. But in my experience with NYU, certainly, there was attention to test scores for sure and grades, but, a good personal statement went a long way. Really knowing why you wanted to go to law school also went a long way. But, there's a number of soft factors that go into it as well, in terms of recruiting a diverse class that's representative of the country and the world. Certainly we'd look to round out, sometimes there are non-traditional applicants or students who had a particular niche interest in a particular area of law.
Well, that's great. So you're saying the soft factors do matter, of course. It's not just the LSAT score and the GPA. What are some things you typically see among strong applicants in terms of their personal statements or diversity statements, addenda? What stands out to you?
Sure. So, I'll start first with the personal statement because that is, essentially the most important part of the application besides the LSAT and the GPA. But at the end of the day, the personal statement should really be a reflection of who you are. What I would always tell applicants or prospective students is that it should sound like you. So it doesn't have to be particularly flowery language, but, it should be a little bit more formal. And it should highlight, an experience or two that you feel is really essential to your story so far. So, a lot of law schools limit the personal statement to 2 or 3 pages, which is pretty typical. So in that time, it might be good to tell a couple anecdotes. Sometimes people would talk certainly about their backgrounds. Sometimes they would talk about what their future would look like or some sort of essential story. And at the end of the day, when I read files, there were so many different stories. And that's what I really took from it. You're not going to sound like someone else. I know this is one of the most intimidating parts of the process. But at the end of the day, have someone look it over and say whether it sounds like you as a person and whether it gets across why law school makes sense at this point in time for you.
No, it's great advice, definitely having people read it over. What are some common pitfalls you see when it comes to the personal statement? I mean, one thing I can think of, you said 2 to 3 pages. Do you ever see some that are a little bit too long sometimes?
Occasionally, yeah. So, I think a lot of law schools actually have pretty strict requirements, whether it's font size or length. But usually we wouldn't get one that was terribly long. So occasionally it would be too long. But I think the pitfalls that students would occasionally run into, obviously spelling, grammar are major ones. Essentially, sometimes students would mention a different law school and they meant to submit that personal statement to a different law school. So that's definitely a red flag, if you haven't read your personal statement carefully. I think in other cases, sometimes they're focusing too much on maybe their parent or somebody else in their life. It's a personal statement, so certainly you can highlight influential figures, but I think at the end of the day, it should focus on yourself. So, certainly if your father or your, grandmother was a lawyer and that influenced you, that can be a little bit of a part of it, but it should essentially be focused on you. You're the one applying.
Right. Naturally. That makes a lot of sense. So I understand you work with students privately now. You can obviously change any of the details, but I'm wondering, are there any particularly amazing essays you've seen or particularly terrible essays you've seen either in your work when you were at NYU Law or now that you're going private?
Sure. So, obviously, due to anonymity, we have to change some details here. But I think occasionally, if a tragedy happened in a student's life, that can certainly be a very, poignant essay. But you just have to be really careful about tone or the amount of details. So certainly, there have been applicants who've gone through some really terrible things. And so I think the focus should be how you got through it and how you worked through such a difficult situation, but not so much on like gratuitous detail. And then focusing on how this experience has, made you feel like law school is the next step in your life.
Yeah, I would imagine so. What about the diversity statement or addendum? Would the same be true there?
Yeah, so the diversity statement, I think what's key for that, it's optional. Certainly personal statements are required, but with a diversity statement, you don't have to write one. So I definitely have some students who struggle with this. Should they, shouldn't they? And, occasionally a student will say, well, I have a very typical background for law school, and, I'm not first generation. I'm not an underrepresented minority. But there are ways to really highlight an experience that isn't shown in the rest of your application. The way that I really tell my students to approach it is, is there something that you can tell that isn't typical of the applicant pool? So for example, if I saw a student that grew up on a farm, that's actually pretty unique these days. That doesn't happen very often. And certainly if they're applying to a place like NYU, that was quite rare. So certainly I've had students write about something like that. Or if they had a really unique hobby. I have a colleague at my current company who's at Yale Law, and she said that one of her classmates is really known for foraging in the forest for truffles. So, that was sort of highlighting his love of food. So, there are ways to really highlight a really interesting part of your background, but it's not absolutely necessary. I've had clients really struggle with this and say, do I need to write one? And we bounced ideas off of each other. And at the end of the day, they didn't feel there was, something that they really wanted to highlight in that diversity statement.
Those are some really great examples. I especially like the example of a hobby, which is something that anyone could pursue. And I can just imagine everyone listening out there brainstorming all these unique hobbies they're going to start adopting just to write a diversity statement. Although we don't need that, of course, is your point. To your point, we don't need a diversity statement necessarily. It's a nice to have, but not required. So those are some great tips there. What about the addenda?
Sure. So addenda aren't always required either, but I feel that a lot of my students do submit them. And the reason why is this: if there's any sort of, situation in your application that you feel needs further explanation, especially if it's regarding, a lower LSAT score or, a trend in your grades, which was a little lower than the rest of your grades, I think it's really important to bring it up and not make excuses. So it should be short and sweet. So I've definitely had students write about, maybe one LSAT score being lower than the others because of, some tragic situation that happened a few days before the test. Or I actually had another student who had a fire happen the day of the LSAT in her building. And so they left for the LSAT, and, the firemen came by. And so that was a very stressful situation. They didn't know what was happening to their building while they're taking this LSAT. So certainly we wrote about that, and I think that was helpful. But not every student needs to submit one, but I kind of err on the side of caution, because when I was reading files, we read a lot of files in any given year. Certainly there are thousands of applications that come in. So if there's any sort of question mark about a situation, in the application that might come up, I think it's best to address it, briefly. Don't go into gratuitous detail. Just say, I had a difficult situation. Maybe there was some family stress, and I was able to get my grades up. But I think at the end of the day, I'd rather know what's going on instead of having to find out later. I did have one example of a student who had a 2-year gap on their resume, and literally my boss at the time said, can you please reach out to them and ask them why they have a 2-year gap? So that saves us time in the long run to not have to do that. So I would rather the student address it in their application.
Yeah, those definitely seem like some clear examples, and I feel bad for that student having a fire happen right before the LSAT. It's hard enough as it is. I can definitely see that having an impact. But what about something where it's maybe somewhat more typical? Like let's say the proctors were really distracting during the LSAT, or there was a marching band outside, which unfortunately does happen more often than it should, believe it or not. So for those cases where it's affecting everybody in the room, let's say, or everyone at the test center, it's not that unique. So is it still worthwhile in that case, do you think?
Yes, I do. If there's some sort of distraction, that's good to let us know, and, just don't sound whiny, about it. So just keep it very simple. Unfortunately I was distracted that day. There was a marching band outside, and, I believe that affected my score, but, please regard this other score as being more indicative of my performance. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I know we're going to get lots of questions about this, so I do want to, not to harp on this too much, but one more example, the digital LSAT. It's coming up later this year, starting July, then September and on. A lot of people are going to be taking the digital LSAT for the first time, and they may not be familiar with the format or using the tablet. And there are probably still some kinks to be worked out from what I've seen, but I'm wondering if someone has a bit of a score drop because of the digital LSAT format, again, would you recommend an addendum?
I would,
Okay.
and certainly I know this is probably going to cause a bit of stress for applicants this cycle, but, it is a huge change going from paper to digital. And, LSAT's been talking about, letting the first set of students who take digitally cancel their score and see it first and then cancel, but only that one time. So I'm sure law schools will understand that it's a big change. And so point that out, it was digital and it wasn't really, I wasn't really used to that format. So certainly I would highlight that, but I wouldn't, make a lot of excuses. I just really be simple with it.
Right. Short, sweet, to the point. So what would you say is like a good maximum word count for an addendum on a topic like this?
I really prefer to stick to a paragraph. I had in my time in admissions, seen a 7-page addendum, which was quite excessive. And, like you can say all that probably in one page. And, lawyers certainly, need to be able to write well. And there's a lot you can say in 7 pages, but there's a lot you can also say in one page. So I really prefer my addenda to be a paragraph or two.
Okay, well, that's definitely a good guideline. And just to get more specific, because for people who are at risk of creating monstrous 1,000-word paragraphs, can we say like 250 words, 300 words? What's a good ballpark?
It really depends on the student. I have worked with clients who had very non-traditional backgrounds. They need to explain their educational history. So literally that would be a page, but we did need a page to talk about all the different situations and address every single potential point that an admissions officer would wonder about. But if it's something as simple as, oh, okay, I didn't do well on LSAT the day, like really just like 200 words would be fine.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Definitely good to have something concrete there, and people will have to limit themselves one way or another. So that's good. But yeah, there's lots of changes this year with the digital LSAT, the writing sample. What stands out to you as being particularly impactful this cycle? What from what you're seeing?
Well, the digital LSAT is huge. Back when I took the LSAT, it was of course paper and it was only offered 4 times a year. But then the fact that the LSAT's also being offered 9 times next cycle, that's pretty incredible. It gives students a lot more options and not feel as much pressure to take a particular exam, which I did feel when I took it. It was only offered every 3 months. So this is better for students in the long run. But with the digital, it remains, to be seen exactly how it will impact students. Maybe it's better, but I think some students naturally will prefer the paper. So it would be a disadvantage for students who prefer the paper format. And, of course, there are kinks to be worked out with whether the scores truly are the same or not with paper versus digital. I don't know if that's really something we'll find out, in our field. Like, I don't know if that data will be published per se, but it's best for students to start preparing now, especially if they plan to be taking digitally, and get used to that format and use the LSAT tutorials.
Yeah, definitely. I think familiarization and practice is really good. LSAC has offered a free tool on their website, familiar.lsac.org, and it's kind of clunky and very 1980s-esque, but it's something. So that's all you got for now. But I'm wondering, in terms of the LSAT being offered more frequently, how does that affect timing in this cycle? Like this cycle, we have people applying with January LSAT scores and March LSAT scores for the same cycle. What do you think are the pros and cons? Do you think it's okay to apply that late with a January or March score, or should people wait until next cycle?
Sure. So I'm the feeling that they should probably wait, especially with March. I don't think vast majority of law schools would take March. What is your thought on that? I feel like that probably wouldn't happen.
Well, I think maybe some do, maybe some don't. I do think more schools are taking March scores than would have taken even February scores a couple of years back. But I'm wondering, just in terms of, even if they'll take the score, is it still worth applying, or is scholarship money kind of dried up, or are odds lower? So I'm just wondering, if someone really feels like they want to get it over with already and apply, would you still caution them to wait?
Yeah, my feeling generally is that I prefer my clients to apply by January. So I think with waiting till taking the January LSAT, you're not going to get your score out till mid-February. which is a significant disadvantage. There are a lot of law schools that are due in February, such as NYU and Columbia and Yale. And, waiting until the very end to have your application be complete with the final LSAT is disadvantage because, there's more scholarship money earlier on. It's rolling admissions. And so a lot of these schools have been giving out offers since the fall. So I would really rather my clients wait till the next cycle if they're going to retake the LSAT in January, March. But, certainly for a student who's really aiming for maybe not the top 50 schools, that might not be as big of a disadvantage.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If someone has competing priorities and other obligations, maybe they do need have a pressing life reason to apply. And if it's a lower tier school where it's not as competitive, maybe it's not that big a deal, is what I hear you saying ultimately. What about for students where let's say they've already applied earlier in the cycle, they're starting to get results back soon, and they're thinking about scholarship money? What do you advise to students in terms of negotiating scholarships or sending updates midway through the cycle? Is there anything you advise clients with on that end?
Sure. So yeah, it can help maybe to retake the LSAT. I know it's a lot of work, but occasionally that can help. But I think what assists them at the end of the day is if they have competing offers with competitor law schools. So in my experience, it matters more if the law school that has given you money is closely ranked to the law school you're trying to negotiate with. Because they're not really going to look at schools significantly below them in rank and feel that offer is comparable. So, they're really aiming to get better yield. So I do think, if you have updates and show deep interest, you can certainly send, an updated transcript if you're still in school or an updated LSAT. But I think at the end of the day with the yield, it really kind of depends on what the school's trying to do with their enrollment. Like each school kind of has their own goals. Maybe one year, like a school's a little short on a certain region of the country, or, maybe there are more females than males in the class and they might want more males. So I do think that does factor into the decision.
Right. So there are these mysterious factors happening within the school that we don't really have any way of knowing what's going on in there. So there's a certain luck of the draw.
Correct. So,
yeah.
There are occasions, of course, where students try to negotiate and they're not able to get more money. But the competitive landscape of law school now in terms of, there are 200 law schools out there and, they all need to fill their classes. So I do find that usually there is a little room to negotiate. It depends though, I'm saying like out of all the schools you're trying to negotiate, probably at least a couple are going to sweeten their offer a little bit.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So at least it's good to know as an applicant that however things play out, it's not necessarily all about you, the applicant. The school has their own needs and considerations, and there's also all the other people out there who may just have different attributes from you. So I think that was a really useful point, Christina. Thanks for that. Speaking of other recent changes, I know that a lot of law schools are starting to take GRE scores now. And I'm wondering, what's your experience working with applicants? Do you see people applying with only the GRE? How does that typically play out?
Yeah, that's a huge change too. And, back when I took the LSAT, I also took the GRE, but no law school took the GRE. And even just 3 years ago, there weren't any law schools that took the GRE. So the fact that there are about 25, 30 law schools now that accept it, that's great. It's interesting because we haven't really seen it, in place for too long, that GRE policy. So it's kind of hard to say how it affects, admission. I have not had a single student apply with just the GRE for law school. So that's how it's, shaken out in my experience. I have had some who've, are currently in grad school or, finished a grad degree that have a GRE. And so they'll, send the score along with our LSAT. But based on anecdotes, it seems like the GRE isn't like a huge factor in admissions yet. It might be more for a non-traditional candidate who already has a graduate degree. But, for someone who's still an undergrad and they just took the GRE, I'm not sure how much more of a chance that would give them in terms of admissions, because the U.S. News and World Report, only reports the LSAT scores of these schools. Like they don't require the GRE. So we don't really have a lot of data on how successful candidates have been with just the GRE.
That's really interesting. So one example I heard was that you had an applicant who had a GRE score already, yet she still took the LSAT to apply to law school.
Correct. Yeah, because at the end of the day, most law schools only take the LSAT, right? So, you're putting yourself at a major disadvantage if you only have a GRE.
Yeah, you'd certainly be limiting your options.
Yes, unless you're, only going for like a very small number of law schools. And I wonder, I know the official line is like to increase access, but I'm not sure how seriously they're, going to take someone who just took the GRE. Maybe if, they are in a position where it would be very expensive to take the LSAT and they already have a GRE, but there's so little data on this, it's hard for us to predict. And I think we're going to have to wait a year or 2 or 3 to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, definitely. Especially we need to see how US News might ultimately react to the rise of GRE as a factor in admissions, even if it is only a very small one. But one thing you said that stood out to me as well is then, the rankings, right? So the rankings are obviously what law school admissions is all about, at least, and for the admission officers sometimes, right? Like, did you ever notice at NYU where you've heard through the grapevine about the impact of the rankings on admissions decisions?
I don't know if how much I can really say about this, but I do think certain law schools do care a lot about them. And then other law schools that, I had colleagues that didn't seem to care about them as much. It kind of depends. Like, certainly they have so much influence on like where students apply, but I don't think a place like Yale, for example, is going to care a lot about the US News rankings. Like, I honestly don't think that's a huge part of their strategy, but certainly for other schools, like, it's a big deal. And like, trying to move up in the rankings is really important to them. But yeah, in terms of strategy, I think for the top schools, like, certainly, there is a lot of attention to the average of the class, right? And so they have to report these to US News, and they also have the required, ABA reports, every year that, give a lot of data about the student profile. But I think it just really depends on the individual school, how much they emphasize it, whether, it's the dean of the school or, I think at the end of the day, some schools are going to be more regional and it's not going to be as big of a deal to them.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, certainly for the top 5, whether they're ranked 4 or 5 one year, everyone knows they're a great school. And these could be tiny, minute differences that are really unimportant, like the size, number of books in the library or something like that, right?
Yes.
But one thing I think of with the top schools, though, is that even if they're not stressing over their exact placement in the rankings, they would still be thinking, well, am I admitting someone who has no LSAT score and is not going to impact the rankings in any way, versus someone who may have a score that's at or slightly above the median, which could help potentially raise the school's ranking, of course, if there were many students in aggregate. So I'm still thinking it conveys a certain degree of seriousness on the part of the applicant as well as potential benefit to the school.
Exactly. So, I mean, the GRE isn't a data point yet for US News in the law school rankings. So I just don't think that we can really say what the impact is. But then if they started including it, certainly I think the GRE scores would have to be pretty comparable to the LSAT in terms of the percentile rankings. And I did hear rumblings, that they are kind of looking at the GRE in a similar way, like what percentile is that student among the other test takers.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing about the 2 different exams is that it's significantly easier to get a 95th or 97th or 99th percentile score on the GRE than on the LSAT, just because they're very different pools of test takers.
Completely agree, because I took both tests, and in all honesty, I found the GRE much easier for me. But, I was pretty familiar with the SAT, and reading comprehension was easily my best section, whereas, the LSAT certainly is going to do a lot more with logical reasoning, and, those are skills that are super important to lawyers down the road.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the reason it's considered valid and reliable is because it's a good predictor of first-year law school grades. And from everything I've seen, they haven't really shown the same for the GRE quite as definitively.
Yes, I know there are a bunch of studies being thrown out there, but at the end of the day, I do feel that LSAT is more predictive of the first-year law school grades. But it doesn't 100% correlate, of course. There is a correlation also with your GPA in undergrad, but not 100%. No, we're close. So I think it was always a little bit of a surprise, like who ended up, ranked top in the class each year based on like what we saw with their LSAT and their grades, because it wasn't 100%, correlated for sure. No,
for sure. There are so many other things in terms of your work ethic, other obligations, and then just the competition within your class and how you adjust to law school. A lot of factors there. Well, Christina, this has been a lot of fun. any final words of wisdom or anything to share with prospective applicants as they get ready to submit their law school applications?
Sure. So I was a history major, and I think one amazing thing about reading all these applications, they're all completely different from each other. I know there's a lot of stress, obviously, with applying and telling your unique, background and story. But each component should really highlight a different part of yourself. And so I tell my students to think about each section as like a chapter, right? So the personal statement highlights a certain chapter. If you have a diversity statement, that highlights a chapter. Your recommendations, which you don't necessarily always see, tell a little different side of you. So altogether, it should make sense. Okay, so it should kind of feel complete, like from beginning to end, there's this life component and you're highlighting different things. So try to avoid being repetitive. We read these applications, in one sitting. We don't, read half of it and then finish the other half later. We want to read it in one go and get that complete overview. So think of it that way. Like, don't repeat yourself. Like, sometimes applicants want to really highlight a part of the background, but if you already mentioned it in a different way, like 3 different times, that's not really useful. So, certainly you can talk about one area of your life and then pull out a more specific area of your life, but try to have it all work together as pieces of a puzzle that fit, as opposed to really like saying the same thing over and over again.
That makes a lot of sense. You've only got so much space on the application. You might as well share as much as you possibly can. That's great advice, Christina. Thank you for that. And what's the best way for applicants to reach you if they're interested in asking questions or potentially working with you? How could they connect?
Sure. So I'm at Ingenious Prep, and we are headquartered in New Haven, Connecticut, but we do have offices around the world. And my colleague, Grace Kennedy, who's in marketing, she can be reached at grace.kennedy@ingenious, INGENIUSPREP.com.
Okay, awesome. Well, I definitely encourage applicants to reach out to Grace to potentially connect with you and work with you. You're definitely a great source of wisdom on the law school application process. So again, thanks for joining. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Same. Be well.